Hello. My work is focused on developing inclusion and equity in education. The terms are rather jargon, really. To try to make them simpler, in work I did with UNESCO, we talked about this being about every learner matters and matters equally. So that's the sort of principle that guides everything I do. And the approach I use is a form of action research. I call it collaborative inquiry because what that implies is people working together to collect evidence to try to move their schools forward. And I talk about it being school improvement with attitude, school improvement based on a set of principles. The work that I've been doing with lots of colleagues over many years, so if I keep talking about we, I'm just trying to remind people that it's not just me that I'm talking about in terms of this work, has involved me working with schools and school systems to put that principle into practice. The approach we used is very much built on people working together, collecting evidence to identify and address barriers that some learners are experiencing. Now, when I say barriers, I need to just clarify what I mean. They can take all kinds of forms. The curriculum can be a barrier if it's not designed with all children in mind. The assessment systems we use can be a barrier if they don't celebrate the progress of all the children, some of whom may be making quite slow progress. And of course, our teaching methods can be a barrier if we don't know how to design a classroom where all children can participate and learn. And then, of course, there are barriers in our minds, attitudes perhaps, assumptions, which stop us from believing that things are possible. Now, be clear, when I talk about barriers, I'm not talking about barriers within children or barriers within families. That's the old thinking. I'm talking about addressing barriers within context. I want to give you a flavour of that work, what that work looks like. My colleagues and I, some years ago, developed a framework that we found quite useful. It's not a complicated thing. We've called it the ecology of equity, the ecology of equity. And essentially what we're saying is when you're addressing issues of equity and inclusion in a particular context, you need to look at three sets of factors. Factors within schools, factors between schools, and factors beyond schools. And through our work, quite a lot of different places in different parts of the world, what we've seen is how if people within a school use that framework to collect and engage with evidence in their schools, that's likely to stimulate innovations to find better ways of reaching the children we're not reaching at the moment. So let me give you a few examples to give you what that looks like. I worked with one quite large secondary school, and usually what we do, my colleagues and I, when we're working with schools, we ask the schools to create a staff inquiry group, an inquiry group of teachers, maybe others beyond teachers as well, who are going to investigate their own school. Their starting point was that they believed that there were some children in their school who were being overlooked, who were sort of not being engaged, not being addressed. They chose, it was a big school, they chose to focus on one particular year group. These were students around the age of 14 or 15. They had quite a lot of statistical data, including data on children who were getting recommendations and celebrations of their progress, but also they had records of children who were getting into difficulty. The assumption of the teachers who were involved in this study was it would be quite a small group of students. They also assumed that these students were likely to be the students who were kind of behind in their work. When they looked at the statistics, they had surprises. Now, this is the nature of this work. It creates surprises. It stops people, makes them think about things in new ways. They found, in fact, that almost 40% of the students in that year group never got commendations, never got punishments, if you like. 40%. So, working with the group, we decided we need more evidence. As well as statistical evidence, we needed qualitative evidence. So, the teachers and our colleagues from the university spent some time observing lessons. And it became evident that these overlooked children could be spotted because often these were the children or young people whose names were not mentioned during lessons. Often they would put their hands up and they were overlooked. They were there, in a sense they're included, but in a sense they were kind of hidden. The teachers decided that these students were invisible students. We then did some focus group interviews with some of the students, and we didn't know who the individual students were. But again, through the discussion, it became evident who they were. Some of them were quite angry. One of the things that the teachers had thought that these would be the students who were falling behind in the learning. Some of them were quite successful learners, doing very well. A lot of them were teenage girls who were very angry about being overlooked. I remember one girl saying to me, I come to the lesson every day, I do my homework, I behave very well, nobody seems to notice me, nobody seems to know my name. And then there are other students, and if they just behave for a little while, then they get a reward. To adolescents in particular, have a great sense of fairness about all of this. So this discussion in the school then was widened to the whole staff, and there was quite a lot of debate and actually quite a lot of argument, but then they had a whole year pushing to make sure that in their lessons they were making sure that everybody's name was mentioned, that everybody was included, and that in fact the school was moving in an inclusive direction. So we did a lot of work on that kind of thing, and it is about evidence, and it's about using different evidence, statistics, observation, listening to the voice of learners themselves, and it's the combination of those different kinds of data. We sometimes call that triangulation in the kind of research methods world. So the second part of our ecology of framework is between schools. So we're talking about moving knowledge around within schools, but we've seen how schools can actually learn from each other. So to give an example, I'm working with a network of primary schools at the moment, and what they've decided to do is the network has created learning threes. So all the schools are in threes. And fairly recently, I spent a morning with the deputy head teachers, principals of 3 of the schools, when they spent a morning carrying out what we call peer inquiry. It's not an evaluation, it's not an inspection, it's actually schools learning from each other through this process of collaborative inquiry. The 3 deputy head teachers spent the morning wandering around the school, observing lessons in quite an informal way, talking to the children, talking to the teachers. Actually, they also took photographs using their cameras. They'd agreed how they would do that ethically. And then at the end of the morning, we had this wonderful discussion where we sat down and they talked and they shared ideas about what they'd seen. This was very powerful professional learning. All the schools serve quite disadvantaged kids. And what happened was, as they talked, one of the deputy heads said, I noticed in the nursery class, in the early years class, the children hardly speak unless an adult speaks with them. And they had a wonderful conversation about this. And she said, that's what happens in our school. But it only made me think about it coming to your school and learning about it. So what we're seeing here again is how surprises draw people's attention to things that might be overlooked. I've described these surprises as interruptions. You're interrupting the life of the school. So it's an inquiry, interruptions, making decisions within the school and between schools. Then there's the third dimension, the most difficult and the most challenging, beyond the school gate. How do we collaborate, of course, first of all with the families, but then everybody else who has a life that connects to the life of children and young people. Some years ago, I led a very large improvement project in Greater Manchester, the city where I live, a project which involved about 1,300 schools. And I was there partly as the kind of figurehead of this programme. It's called the Greater Manchester Challenge. And so one of my jobs was to go around and stimulate interest in what we were doing. So I went to the Halley Orchestra, one of the great international orchestras, and the people there said, oh yes, we work with schools, but we could do a lot more. I went to the BBC that had just recently moved into that area, and they said the same. We work with schools, but we could do a lot more. I went to arts organisations. I went to the big football clubs. Manchester United, of course. I even made a sacrifice and went to Manchester City, and they said the same thing. We could work with schools, and we do work with schools, but we could do more. And of course, here are the sort of barriers that we experience within our profession of teachers. Is everybody's so busy, there isn't time to reach out and draw people into our improvement efforts. So there are all sorts of challenges and dilemmas in all of this, but it does seem to me that is the way forward. You create a school that is, in business we would call it a learning organisation, a school that is geared to collecting evidence, engaging with evidence, and then taking action. It's not so much about taking practical ideas from somewhere else or imposing new techniques or new organisation systems. It's an organic process of learning within the school, and it's led from within the school And so there are implications, of course, for senior people who've got to make the time for this to happen, but also they've got to support the people who are leading on this kind of improvement effort. We're still learning about all of that, and I hope people who are listening to this will be able to also follow similar pathways, and we can learn from one another. In the world of school improvement, and that's what we're talking about, school improvement with attitude, it's often said that school improvement is technically simple but socially complex. It's not that difficult to describe what schools need to do to move in an inclusive and equitable direction. We can describe it. The complexity comes when we try to get everybody together and work together. It's a social process, evidence-based, of moving, thinking and practice. And what I conclude from lots of experience of this kind of work is that schools always have more expertise available and more creativity than is currently being used. So the consequence of that is we've got to bring people together to move schools forward. And so for me, a key message to leave you with is the importance of the collective will to make it happen. The collective will to make it happen. Thank you.